We are now ready to look at the first step in designing a reading or writing process for our students. And we start, as we decided earlier on, with learning outcomes. So we figure out how we need to define the learning outcomes, and side by side, obviously, we will also need to decide how these learning outcomes are to be measured. This is not going to be a comprehensive, exhaustive presentation because we cannot look at every possible type of learning outcome that we can use, but this is to give everyone an idea of the approach, and then each one of us can tailor this to our own expectations. We start with the learning outcomes, as we have seen, because no matter what we provide for the students, no matter what we give them, what we ask them to read, no matter how extraordinary our lectures might be, if by the end of our studio or course the student doesn't show that they have achieved the learning outcome, it means quite literally that our teaching has failed. So it might be that they've had a brilliant experience during the lecture, but they are still not able to do, and they are still not able to demonstrate that they know the things that we intended for them to know. That means that at least some of the time spent in that particular process has been wasted. It's not to say that they haven't gained anything out of it, but it's to say that the time has not been used entirely constructively, and more work will have to be put in order for them to achieve the same thing that we wanted them to know how to do. So what is a learning outcome? A learning outcome, very simply put, it's not difficult at all, is what the student will know and what the student will be able to do by the end of the course. With disciplines such as ours, our focus is more and more on what the students are able to do. That is a focus on the skills and on the abilities. But we cannot forget that knowledge actually is essential. You cannot know how to do something if you don't have the understanding of it, the knowledge of it, right? So even though knowledge is difficult to measure, there are ways to look at how knowledge is demonstrated, how knowledge becomes actionable, how knowledge is something that we take into our lives and implement. So when we talk about learning outcomes, this refers to what our students will know and will be able to do by the end of the course. The learning outcome is different from the output or from the assignment. The student might give us a piece which is an essay or which is a design intent, but that does not show to us that they have achieved their learning outcome, right? That is just a piece of writing that they have given us. What we mean when we say learning outcome is the ability to demonstrate that they know how to write that type of thing by assessing the submission that they have made on clear parameters that we have to establish, which is why the learning outcomes need to be defined very clearly. And the process goes a little bit like this. So very practically, I as a tutor believe that it's important for my students to know how to read well. Why do I believe that? Because my experience shows me that sometimes people struggle with this, because I think all of us in our professional lives will need to read things, and we need to read them accurately, and sometimes that is difficult. So what I'm saying is that for my course, for my studio, as far as reading and writing is concerned, I want the learning outcome to be that the students will read accurately both academic and non-academic texts in their discipline. I'm not concerned with them being able to read high theory, that is okay, but I am concerned with them being able to read texts from their area, from their domain, and read them accurately, right? Now, what does it take in order to be able to read a text accurately? Because this reading accurately is also a big concept. So how do I evaluate whether someone has read it accurately or not? What does it take for me as a person to read something and I know I read it well? Which is where we detail out the learning outcomes, and we say that by the end of the course, by the end of the studio, the students will be able to show the following: that they can identify the main argument of a text, which means that they will have to have the knowledge of what an argument is. They will have to know what a premise is. So they will be able to use that knowledge in order to identify the main argument of the text and the premises on which the text is based. It also means that the students will be able to identify the gaps in argumentation. So not only will they see and read and understand what the text says, but they will also be able to see whether it's logically connected, whether it makes sense, whether it follows, or whether it's just sold to us like that. And the students will be able to relate that reading to their professional experience. So they will be able to take what a professional has written about their own practice and say, all right, in this studio project, I can use this knowledge like this. This connection is difficult to make. It doesn't take place automatically, so I want to specify it as a learning outcome. Right? This is how we go about thinking when it comes to the learning outcomes. Let's look at another example. I, as a tutor, think it is important for my students to know how to write a proposal. Now, is it enough to say my learning outcome is a proposal? Absolutely not. A proposal is a type of writing. It's not an outcome, it's an output. It's what the students will write, right? But the learning outcome cannot be that. The learning outcome needs to be concerned with what it takes to write a proposal that is well written, that is well articulated. And so, what we're saying is something more like this. I want my students broadly to demonstrate that they can write a clear, well argued proposal, and this entails the following detailed learning outcomes. It entails an ability to describe their observations of the site that they have visited. We know what description means because we've looked at the rhetorical modes. It entails the ability to analyze what they have seen. So they identify the patterns, they see the logical connections, and they express them. It entails the ability to propose an intervention, because it's a proposal after all. They will propose something, right? And they will be able to justify their proposal based on their analysis. All of this is what makes a good proposal. So it's not enough for me to say my learning outcome is going to be an ability to write a clear, well-argued proposal. I need to really reflect and think, what does it take to present all of this? And very often, if we haven't thought about it before, if we haven't done this already, what we need in order to identify the detailed learning outcomes is to actually read a well-written proposal and to say what has gone into the making of this. So for us as tutors, sometimes looking at the sample, at something that has gone well, and looking at the student sample and seeing where they falter is what may help us identify where to set our learning outcomes. And once we have done this, we take the next step and we ask, how are we going to assess whether the students have learned what we wanted them to learn? How are we going to assess whether the learning outcomes have been achieved? We can do that by assessing two things. An exam, so we ask the students to sit and write or take an MCQ test or do whatever in exam mode, or we assess their student output, which is a text that they submitted. How do we assess this? We assess this based on very clear standards. So this much will count as a well-identified argument, this much will count as a well-written proposal. We have to decide this. It's not easy, we consider it very often intuitive and we give an overall grade, but by doing that, we're not using the most efficient way of assessing the learning outcomes that our students have achieved. So let's look at examples in order to understand how these decisions are made, because after all, what we're interested in is the practical aspect of how do we do it for our own course. For example, we are looking at learning outcomes concerning reading, right? So the learning outcomes, as we've seen, are that the students will demonstrate the ability to identify the arguments made by a text along with the premises, identify the gaps, relate the reading to their professional experience. How will we assess this? We will assess this via a timed reading exam. Why did I make this decision? I made this decision because I think that if I just ask the students to read at home and to maybe fill a sheet or come and talk in class about what they have read, I will not be able to measure accurately whether they can read well. I think that the only accurate way of measuring that I can come up with is if they are all sitting in class, they have the same amount of time, assuming equal ability among all of them. So, if one of the student is functioning with a disability, then I might have to provide more time. But otherwise, in the same amount of time, they are given the same text, they are all reading it, and then they have to demonstrate their ability to identify the argument, to identify the substantiation, and to relate things to their professional experience. So, what I have done here is that I have decided to measure each aspect that I have placed in my list of learning outcomes. What I have done also is to miss out on something. This is important. So, I aim to make sure that the students learn how to identify gaps in arguments. But when I decided on the nature of my exam, I did not look at the identification of gaps in the argument. So, this is a learning outcome that I have set up, and yet I am not measuring it. Which means what? That by the end of the course, I will not be able to say with certainty, yes, my students are able to do this. At the same time, what I have done is to plan to check whether they write grammatically correct prose, grammatically correct text. Now, can I do this? Should I do this in the exam? While correct writing, correct grammar is crucial, is important, I did not set it up as a learning outcome from the beginning. And if I didn't do that, my test shouldn't measure for it. I cannot be concerned with something that is not part of my focus in my learning outcomes. If I think that grammatically correct writing is essential in the demonstration of an ability to read, then I should put it on the learning outcomes from the very beginning. If not, I need to take it out of the rubric itself. So once I decide on the manner in which I will test, the manner in which I will assess, the next thing I need to do is to come up with a detailed grading rubric. It is not that I sit there and look at the exam and say, this is more or less okay. No. Before the students write the exam, before I set the exam, I need to decide what for me is acceptable level of performance and what is not. So even for something as simple as identification of the argument, based on the level of the learners I'm engaging with, I will need to be able to say that if the student identifies the correct thing, says it clearly, does not pick on anything extraneous, does not have any misunderstanding, I will count that as a win. I will say this is very good. But I will say it is insufficient if what the student has selected as the argument is wrong. Wrong meaning it's only applicable for part of the text, or they really misunderstood things. If that is the case, I will say the student has not achieved the learning outcome, so the performance is insufficient, the demonstration is insufficient. If they are saying it badly, if they cannot show me that they understood it well, that is also insufficient. And obviously, I will have something in between. Now, this process of thinking, of saying what will I consider achievable and of high standard, what will I consider insufficient, what will I consider a middling achievement of this learning outcome, that process will have to take place for every category that I have decided to measure. So it's a process that is time consuming but has to be done beforehand, because otherwise when we grade we will be influenced by what our students have done. And at the back of our minds we will have all these excuses. Maybe I didn't focus on this in class enough. Maybe the student didn't get it, what if it's my fault, right? So our grading will be determined by that, and we cannot allow this to happen. We need to be able to be honest on whether the student has achieved what we wanted them to achieve or not. Let's consider another possible example. So in this particular case, we're looking at the proposal, and we said that for a good proposal, the students will have to demonstrate the ability to describe, analyze, propose the intervention, and argue the logic of the intervention. Now in this case, I'm telling myself, you know what, I do want them to write an exam. Why not? Because I know that a well written proposal takes time. That in their professional lives, they will spend multiple drafts, rework a proposal, so that is fine, that's part of the process. So, what I want them to do is to submit a proposal as a final submission, and this is what I will assess. Notice that I have also decided that I will not assess at various intermediate stages. I'm not asking them to give me a description first and then I assess that. Give me analysis, I assess that. Give me a proposal, I assess that. No, I'm saying, you know what? I will assess you only on the final thing. That is a decision that is actively done. I have reasons for it. I'm saying, for instance, that the students have already gone through this process, they're expected to know all these stages, they're expected to perform them all together, so I'm not looking at the stages. But if my students are doing this for the first time, then I will probably divide and I will probably assess at various stages, right? But in this case, I've taken a call, I'm only assessing the final submission. My grading rubric will have to include details on the clarity, detail, and appropriateness of the description, the quality of the analysis, and that will mean whether they identified patterns, whether they're looking at things chronologically and logically and articulating them, all of that. My grading rubric will also look at whether they're saying clearly how they want to intervene and whether they're able to explain what aspects of the analysis have led to what decisions when it comes to the intervention. So, with this, we have reached this point where we need to set up the grading rubric like we did earlier on and do that in appropriate detail, and obviously then share it with our students so that our students know what is expected of them. So this is what we mean when we talk about learning outcomes. This is what we need to think of first thing before we even say that we want our students to go through the following process. Hopefully it is clear. Please try to practice this considering your own assignments, your own learning outcomes within the courses and the studios that you teach, and see whether it makes sense. Identify the questions that you have and take the opportunity to discuss these both with us and with your peers.